A cop adopts a black baby that he found in a park. Over the years, he pours his heart into raising the child, but things take an unexpected turn when years later his biological father returns. What will happen to the family they've built, and how will the cop react to seeing his son's real father? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jake Martin drove his police truck slowly through the quiet streets of Cedar Grove, watching the autumn leaves dance across his path in the fading sunlight. The evening air had turned crisp, and the setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks. He adjusted his collar against the chill, scanning the familiar neighborhood with practiced eyes. Just another peaceful evening, he murmured to himself, turning onto Maple Street that ran alongside the community park. "Officer Jake! Officer Jake!" The sudden chorus of children's voices caught his attention. He spotted a group of kids waving frantically near the playground, their backpacks still on from school. Jake pulled over, stepping out of his truck. "What's going on?" he called out, walking toward them. "Over here, by the swings!" A girl with pigtails pointed urgently toward a wicker basket, partially hidden beneath the play structure. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he approached. There, nestled in what looked like a clean blanket, lay a baby. The infant's dark eyes met his, curious and alert. Jake knelt down, his training kicking in as he quickly assessed the situation. "Did anyone see who left the baby here?" he asked, carefully checking the infant's condition. The baby was warm, clean, and appeared well cared for, despite being abandoned. The children shook their heads. "We just found him," a boy in a red jacket explained. "We were playing and saw the basket." Jake gently lifted the baby, who couldn't have been more than a few months old. The infant made a soft cooing sound, tiny fingers reaching up to touch Jake's badge. Something tightened in Jake's chest, a feeling he hadn't expected. "How long have you kids been here?" he asked, scanning the empty park. The swings creaked softly in the evening breeze, but there was no sign of anyone else around. "Maybe 15 minutes, the girl with pigtails answered. "We didn't see anybody leave the baby." Jake held the infant close, protecting him from the growing chill. The sun had nearly set now, casting long shadows across the playground. He couldn't leave the baby here. That much was certain. "All right, kids, I need you to head home now. It's getting dark," Jake said firmly but kindly. "I'll take care of the baby." As the children gathered their things and left, Jake walked back to his truck, his mind racing. The weight of the black baby in his arms felt both foreign and somehow right. He carefully opened the passenger door, realizing he had no car seat. "Okay, little one," he said softly, fashioning a makeshift secure spot using his jacket and the seatbelt. "This isn't exactly by the book, but we'll drive extra careful." The baby watched him with those intense dark eyes, and Jake felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him. His hands trembled slightly as he secured the infant, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility that had suddenly landed in his lap. "I don't know what's going to happen next," Jake admitted to the baby, who responded with a tiny yawn. "But I promise you're safe now." Jake drove through the quiet neighborhoods of Cedar Grove. His police radio remained silent, but his thoughts were anything but peaceful. The baby stirred beside him, making tiny noises that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the night. Jake checked his watch. 9:17 p.m. The situation felt surreal, like something from a movie rather than his usually predictable evening patrol. He'd dealt with lost children before, but never one so young, so vulnerable. The truck slowed to a stop at a red light on Main Street. Jake turned to look at the infant, who was watching him with those same alert eyes from earlier. The baby cooed, a sweet sound that made Jake's heart twist with uncertainty. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he whispered, running through his options. The police station was closed for the night. Only the emergency dispatch was operating. Child services wouldn't open until morning, and the thought of handing the baby over to them made him unexpectedly hesitant. The light turned green and Jake continued driving, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. He tried to remember what he knew about babies, but his mind drew a blank. Did they need special food? How often did they eat? What about diapers? I don't even have a crib, he muttered, glancing again at his passenger. The baby had started playing with the edge of the blanket, completely unaware of Jake's growing anxiety. The familiar streets led him toward his small house on Oak Avenue. Jake's palms grew sweaty on the steering wheel as he considered what taking care of an infant might entail. He'd never even babysat before. His experience with children was limited to brief encounters during his patrol duties. Still, the thought of any other option felt wrong. The baby needed somewhere safe for the night, and Jake's home was as good as any. He could figure out the details tomorrow when offices opened, and he could properly report finding the infant. Jake pulled into his driveway, the headlights illuminating his modest single-story home. The porch light cast a warm glow over the front steps, but the house had never looked more daunting. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the quiet ticking of the cooling engine and the soft sounds of the baby beside him. "Okay," he said, taking a deep breath. "We can do this. It's just one night, right?" The baby responded with another coo, as if trying to reassure him. Jake stepped out of the truck and walked around to the passenger side, his heart pounding with the weight of responsibility. He carefully gathered the infant in his arms, making sure the blanket was secure against the night air. Looking down at the tiny face nestled against his chest, Jake felt a mix of terror and determination. He had no idea what he was doing, but he knew he had to try. With another steadying breath, he walked toward his front door, ready to face whatever challenges the night might bring. Jake gently placed the baby on his worn leather couch, creating a small nest of cushions around the tiny body. The infant's dark eyes followed his movements, curious and alert despite the late hour. The usual silence of Jake's home felt different now, filled with the soft sounds of baby breaths and occasional coos. "We need to get you comfortable, little one," Jake murmured, looking around his bachelor pad with new eyes. His living room, usually perfectly adequate for his needs, suddenly seemed woefully unprepared for an infant. He hurried to his bedroom, rummaging through drawers and closets. His hands landed on his softest Police Academy t-shirt, clean and well-worn. "This might work," he said to himself, returning to the living room where the baby had started to fuss. The temperature seemed to have dropped, and Jake noticed the baby's tiny hands had grown cold. He rushed to his hall closet, pulling out his thickest winter blanket, a plush navy blue throw his grandmother had given him years ago. With careful movements, he folded it over the small form, making sure not to cover the baby's face. Just as Jake thought things were settling down, the infant's face scrunched up, and a sharp cry pierced the quiet. "Oh no, no, no," Jake whispered, his heart racing. He reached out, hesitating for just a moment before gently placing his hand on the baby's back, patting in what he hoped was a soothing rhythm. "It's okay, buddy, you're safe here," he said softly, continuing the gentle patting. To his surprise, the crying began to subside. The baby's eyes started to droop, tiny fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. Jake found himself settling down on the carpet beside the couch, unable to look away from his tiny guest. Every small movement the baby made caught his attention. When the infant's hand wrapped around his finger, Jake felt something shift inside him, a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed. Finally, the baby's breaths evened out into the peaceful rhythm of sleep. Jake watched the tiny chest rise and fall, a strange sense of peace washing over him despite the unusual circumstances. Still sitting on the floor, his head rested against the couch cushion near the sleeping infant, and he slowly drifted off to sleep. Next morning, Jake blinked awake, his neck stiff from sleeping in an awkward position on the floor. For a moment, he felt disoriented. Then the events of the previous night rushed back as he heard a soft coo nearby. The baby lay bundled in Jake's thick blanket on the couch, dark eyes wide open and watching him intently. Despite his exhaustion from waking up several times during the night, a smile tugged at Jake's lips. "Good morning, little guy," he whispered, his voice rough with sleep. Jake pushed himself up from the floor, his muscles protesting. He needed to get moving. The CPS office would be opening soon. After a quick shower and change of clothes, he returned to find the baby still contentedly lying there, tiny fingers reaching toward the ceiling. "Okay, buddy," Jake said softly, gathering the infant in his arms. "Time to get you somewhere they can take proper care of you." The baby nestled against his chest, and Jake felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. He grabbed his keys and headed out to his truck, taking extra care as he secured the infant in the passenger seat, using the blanket to keep him stable. The morning traffic moved slowly through town, which suited Jake just fine. He drove carefully, constantly checking on his tiny passenger. His mind wandered to the previous night, the surprising discovery in the park, the way the baby had gripped his finger while falling asleep, those peaceful moments of connection in the quiet hours. Who would leave you all alone like that? Jake wondered aloud, glancing at the infant. The baby just blinked at him, making small gurgling sounds. As they approached the CPS office, Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He knew this was the right thing to do. He was a police officer, not a parent. The baby needed proper care, maybe even had family out there looking for him. But something about the thought of walking away made his chest ache. The CPS building came into view, its brick facade somehow imposing despite its modest size. Jake pulled into a parking spot and turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, looking at the baby who had somehow worked his way into Jake's heart overnight. "Well, little one," he said, reaching over to adjust the blanket. "Let's get you inside." His movements were deliberately slow as he lifted the infant from the truck, cradling him close one last time before walking toward the building's entrance. Jake pushed open the heavy glass door of the CPS office, the baby secure in his arms. The front desk sat empty, but a woman in her mid-40s hurried out from a back office, files clutched to her chest. Her kind face broke into a tired smile as she approached. "I'm Anna," she said, extending her hand. "How can I help you today?" Jake shifted the baby carefully to shake her hand. "Officer Jake Martin. I found this little one abandoned in Thompson Park last night." Anna's face softened as she looked at the infant. "Poor thing. Let's get the details down." She led Jake to her cramped office, where stacks of folders covered every surface. As she cleared a chair for him, several papers slipped to the floor. "Sorry about the mess," she apologized, scrambling to pick them up. "We're a bit overwhelmed right now." Jake settled into the chair, the baby still peaceful against his chest. He explained the previous night's events while Anna typed notes into an ancient-looking computer, the keyboard clicking loudly in the small space. "The thing is," Anna said, rubbing her temples, "we're completely at capacity right now. All our emergency placement homes are full, and finding foster families for infants is especially challenging." She gestured at the piles of files surrounding them. Each of these represents a child needing placement. Jake's stomach tightened. "So what happens to him?" "Well," Anna leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Given his age and our current situation, the best option might be for him to stay with you for just a few more days. It would be much better than placing him in our facility. We're understaffed as it is." Jake looked down at the baby who had grabbed onto his shirt with one tiny fist. "I don't know anything about caring for a baby," he admitted. "We can provide guidance over the phone," Anna assured him. "It would just be for a few days until we can find a proper placement." Jake fell silent, his thumb unconsciously stroking the baby's small hand. The thought of leaving the infant in this overcrowded facility made his chest tight. After a long moment, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll keep him for now." Relief washed over Anna's face as she handed him some basic paperwork to fill out. Once completed, Jake stood up, adjusting the baby in his arms. Walking back through the shabby waiting room, he felt a mix of anxiety and something else, a protective instinct he hadn't expected. The baby snuggled closer as they stepped outside, and Jake held him a little tighter as they made their way to the truck. Jake steered his truck carefully toward home, his mind racing with all the things he'd need to learn about caring for a baby. The infant dozed peacefully in the makeshift car seat arrangement, completely unaware of Jake's growing anxiety. As he drove past the familiar houses of his neighborhood, his eyes landed on Mrs. Harper's neat little blue house with its cheerful flower boxes. He pulled into his driveway, then gently lifted the sleeping baby from the truck. The short walk to Mrs. Harper's front door felt longer than usual as he rehearsed how to explain his unusual situation. He heard slow, shuffling footsteps approaching. The door opened, revealing Mrs. Harper in her usual floral apron, her silver hair neatly pinned back. Her eyes widened at the sight of Jake holding a baby. "Jake?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "Is that—" "Mrs. Harper, I know this looks strange," Jake began, shifting his weight nervously. "But I could really use your help." She opened the door wider, gesturing for him to come inside. Her living room was cozy and warm, with comfortable furniture and the smell of fresh-baked cookies in the air. Jake settled onto her floral print sofa, carefully cradling the baby. "I found him abandoned in Thompson Park last night," Jake explained, his voice soft to avoid waking the infant. He told her about the children who'd discovered the basket, his night of improvised baby care, and the overwhelming visit to CPS. Mrs. Harper listened intently, her kind face showing concern as Jake described the crowded conditions at the CPS office. When he finished, she leaned forward in her armchair. "So they asked you to keep him temporarily?" she asked. Jake nodded. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I was wondering if you might be able to help watch him while I'm on duty. I don't have anyone else to turn to." Mrs. Harper's face broke into a warm smile. "Oh, Jake, of course I'll help. It's been years since I've cared for a little one, but some things you never forget." Relief flooded through Jake's body. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I don't even know where to start with what he needs." "Well," she said, reaching for a notepad on her side table, "let's make a list. You'll need formula, diapers, proper bottles." She began writing quickly. "There's a good store just down on Mason Street that carries everything you'll need. I can go with you later if you'd like." "That would be wonderful," Jake said gratefully. "Bring him by tomorrow morning before your shift," Mrs. Harper said, patting Jake's hand. "We'll figure this out together." Jake stood carefully, the baby still sleeping soundly against his chest. "I can't thank you enough, Mrs. Harper." "That's what neighbors are for," she replied, walking him to the door. "And Jake, you're doing a good thing." The days settled into an unexpected but comfortable rhythm for Jake. Each morning, he carefully bundled up the baby and drove to Mrs. Harper's house, where she greeted them both with a warm smile. The baby, who had been initially fussy during these transitions, now seemed to recognize the routine, cooing happily when they approached her blue house. "There's my little sunshine," Mrs. Harper would say, reaching for the baby with practiced hands. She had transformed her living room into a makeshift nursery, with soft blankets spread across the floor, and a few toys she dug out from her attic. At work, Jake found himself constantly checking his phone, even though he knew the baby was in good hands. His fellow officers noticed the change in him, the way he rushed through paperwork that used to take hours, how he declined invitations for after-shift coffee. "Someone's got a hot date?" Officer Rodriguez teased one afternoon, watching Jake hurry to clock out. Jake just smiled, unable to explain the pull he felt toward home. The truth was, he couldn't wait to see the baby's face light up when he walked through Mrs. Harper's door. Those moments had become the highlight of his day. Mrs. Harper always had stories to share when Jake arrived. "He rolled over today," she announced proudly one evening. "And you should have seen him tracking my cat across the room. Such a curious little fellow." Jake absorbed every detail, storing away these precious moments. In his spare time, he pored over the baby books Mrs. Harper had lent him, learning about feeding schedules and sleep patterns. He practiced making bottles until he could do it one-handed and learned to distinguish between different types of cries. His once quiet apartment now buzzed with life. The coffee table held more bottles than coffee mugs, and the sound of baby giggles echoed through rooms that used to feel too empty. Jake found himself talking constantly to the baby, describing his day or explaining simple things like why the sky was blue. One evening, Jake sat in his favorite armchair, the baby nestled against his chest. The little one's eyes were heavy with sleep, tiny fingers curled around Jake's thumb. The connection he felt in that moment was overwhelming, a fierce protectiveness mixed with deep affection. As the baby drifted off to sleep, Jake realized how much his life had changed in just a few days. The void he'd never acknowledged was now filled with purpose and joy. He watched the baby's peaceful face, knowing that soon CPS would call, and wondering what that call would mean for both of them. A week later, the phone's ring pierced the early morning quiet. Jake's heart skipped a beat when he saw the CPS number on his screen. Anna's voice was warm but professional as she delivered the news he'd been dreading. "We have space available now," she said. "You can bring the baby in today for placement." Jake's throat tightened. Right, of course. He managed to keep his voice steady, though his hand gripped the phone harder than necessary. After hanging up, he sat on the edge of his bed, running his fingers through his hair. The thought of returning to his quiet, empty apartment made his chest ache. He got dressed mechanically, his movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to delay the inevitable. The walk to Mrs. Harper's house felt shorter than usual. She opened the door before he could knock, the baby already in her arms, giggling at something she'd been doing to amuse him. "Jake, you're early today," she said, then noticed his expression. "What's wrong?" Inside her warm living room, Jake shared the news. "CPS called. They have space now." Mrs. Harper studied his face carefully as she settled into her favorite armchair, the baby contentedly playing with her necklace. "And how do you feel about that?" Jake's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I don't know. These past few days have been..." "They've been wonderful," Mrs. Harper finished for him. "I've never seen you happier, Jake. The way you light up when you see him, how naturally you've taken to caring for him." Jake paced the room, his hands in his pockets. "But I'm not exactly parent material. I'm too young, too inexperienced, and..." He hesitated. "People might judge, seeing a white cop raising a black baby." Mrs. Harper's eyes softened. "Love doesn't see color, Jake. What matters is the heart you put into raising a child." She adjusted the baby in her arms, who was now reaching toward Jake. "Look at him. He doesn't see what others might see. He sees someone who makes him feel safe and loved." "But what if I mess up?" Jake asked, taking the baby when he squirmed insistently toward him. "Every parent messes up sometimes," Mrs. Harper said gently. "What matters is showing up every day with love and dedication. You've already shown you can do that." The baby settled against Jake's chest, tiny fingers clutching his shirt. Mrs. Harper watched them together, a knowing smile on her face. "The question isn't whether you're ready to be a father, Jake. The question is whether you're ready to let him go." Jake looked down at the peaceful face of the baby in his arms, feeling the familiar warmth spread through his chest. Mrs. Harper's words rang true. The thought of saying goodbye was unbearable. With newfound determination, Jake carefully secured the baby in his car seat. The drive to the CPS office was filled with nervous energy, but his mind was clear. As he pulled into the parking lot, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Walking into the office with the baby in his arms, Jake approached Anna's desk. "Before we discuss placement," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I'd like to know more about the adoption process." Anna's eyebrows rose as Jake sat down across from her desk, the baby sleeping peacefully in his arms. The small office felt even more cramped with filing cabinets lining the walls and stacks of papers everywhere. "You want to adopt?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Are you sure about this, officer?" Jake nodded, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I know it might sound crazy. I'm young, single, and this wasn't exactly planned, but these past few days..." He glanced down at the sleeping child. "Something just feels right." "Tell me more about that," Anna said, pulling out a fresh notepad. Jake shifted the baby carefully, making sure not to wake him. "At first, I was terrified. I didn't know the first thing about babies. But then something amazing happened. We just connected. Mrs. Harper, my neighbor, she's been helping me learn everything I need to know. The baby, he's already part of my life." Anna nodded thoughtfully, jotting down notes. "You understand there might be some challenges? Being a single parent isn't easy, and there are cultural considerations to think about." "I've thought about that," Jake admitted, his expression serious. "I know some people might judge a white police officer raising a black child, but Mrs. Harper helped me see that love matters more than what others think. I want to give him a good life to make sure he knows his heritage and culture. I'm willing to learn everything I need to." Anna set down her pen and opened a drawer, pulling out a thick packet of papers. "The process isn't simple," she explained, spreading the documents across her desk. There will be background checks, home visits, and mandatory training sessions. We'll need character references and you'll have to demonstrate financial stability. Jake looked at the stack of papers, feeling slightly overwhelmed but determined. I understand. Whatever it takes. You'll need to attend cultural competency classes too, Anna continued, highlighting specific sections. It's important that transracial adoptive parents understand how to support their child's cultural identity. Jake leaned forward, careful not to disturb the baby. I want to do this right. He deserves nothing less. Anna smiled softly and pushed the initial paperwork toward him. Here's where we start. Take your time reading through everything. Jake shifted the baby to one arm, picked up the pen with his free hand, and began signing where Anna indicated. His signature was slightly shaky, but his resolve was firm. Each page he signed brought him one step closer to making this temporary arrangement permanent. There will be more paperwork, Anna warned, collecting the signed forms, and the process can take months. I'm not going anywhere, Jake replied, looking down at the sleeping child in his arms. We've already come this far together. Slowly, Jake's life transformed in ways he never imagined. His once quiet home now buzzed with activity. Bottles warming on the counter, colorful toys scattered across the floor, and the gentle hum of a baby monitor always in the background. Come on, buddy, just a little more, Jake coaxed, trying to get the baby to finish his bottle at 3 a.m. Dark circles lined his eyes, but his smile remained gentle. The baby squirmed, milk dribbling down his chin. During the day, Mrs. Harper became an invaluable support. She taught Jake how to properly burp the baby, showed him the best way to warm bottles, and offered wisdom earned through years of experience. You're doing wonderfully, she assured him one afternoon, watching Jake master the art of diaper changing. Look how he smiles at you. The adoption process moved steadily forward. Jake attended weekly training sessions after his shifts, learning about everything from child development to cultural awareness. The classes opened his eyes to new perspectives and challenges he hadn't considered. Cultural identity is crucial, the instructor emphasized during one session. Jake took careful notes, determined to provide his son with connections to his heritage. At work, his fellow officers noticed the change in him. Gone was the reserved rookie, replaced by someone more focused yet softer around the edges. They'd catch him showing baby pictures during breaks or discussing pediatrician recommendations with other parent officers. Never thought I'd see Officer Martin shopping for baby clothes, his partner teased good-naturedly after spotting Jake in the department store one day. The baby grew more responsive each day. His first real smile directed at Jake made the officer's heart swell with pride. When tiny hands reached for him after a long shift, exhaustion melted away instantly. Anna from CPS checked in regularly, noting Jake's progress. You're exceeding expectations, she said during one visit, watching Jake naturally respond to the baby's cues. The challenges were real: sleepless nights, constant worry, and moments of pure uncertainty. Jake lost count of how many times he'd rushed to the store for emergency supplies, or called Mrs. Harper in a panic over a slight fever. But sitting in the nursery he'd carefully put together, watching his son drift off to sleep, Jake felt a profound sense of rightness. The room, once his sparse home office, now held a crib, changing table, and walls decorated with cheerful animals. A nightlight cast soft stars across the ceiling as Jake gently rocked the drowsy baby. You're my boy, he whispered, carefully laying the sleeping infant in his crib. Standing there, watching the peaceful rise and fall of his son's chest, Jake knew with absolute certainty that every challenge, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt had been worth it. This was where he belonged. 10 years flew by, and Jake's life settled into a comfortable rhythm with his son. The baby's first words, first school day, and infectious laughter filled their home with joy. Mrs. Harper continued to help, becoming like a grandmother to the child, and Jake mastered the art of balancing work and fatherhood. One morning at the police station, Jake received a new parole case file. As he flipped through the pages, he paused at the photograph of Marcus Keith, a black man in his late 30s recently released from prison. The file detailed a robbery conviction from 10 years ago, But something about Marcus's expression in the mugshot caught Jake's attention. Their first meeting took place in a small room at the station. Marcus sat straight-backed in his chair, his hands folded neatly on the table. His eyes held a mix of wariness and dignity that Jake hadn't expected. "Tell me about yourself, Marcus," Jake said, keeping his tone gentle but professional. Marcus spoke quietly but clearly. "I made a mistake years ago," he began. "My boy was just a baby, maybe 6 months old. His mama left, and I couldn't find work. The bills kept piling up, and I couldn't afford it all." His voice cracked slightly. "I got desperate, tried to rob a convenience store, got caught and convicted, even though I never actually took anything." Jake listened intently, noting how Marcus's shoulders tensed when he mentioned his son. The pain in Marcus's voice resonated with Jake, reminding him of his own fierce, protective instincts toward his child. "What are your plans now?" Jake asked. "I want to make things right," Marcus replied. "Get a job, be someone my son could be proud of. But nobody wants to hire an ex-con." Jake thought for a moment, then reached for his phone. "There's a maintenance position open at my son's school. The principal's a friend. Would you be interested?" Marcus's eyes widened with surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. "Why would you help me?" "Because I believe everyone deserves a second chance," Jake replied simply. "Especially a father trying to do right by his child." After making a quick call, Jake arranged an interview for Marcus. As they wrapped up their meeting, Jake offered some practical advice about staying clean and rebuilding his life. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly as he stood to leave. Not many officers would take the time. Later that evening, as Jake watched his son play with blocks on the living room floor, he thought about Marcus. He understood the desperate love of a father, the fierce need to provide and protect. His own journey into fatherhood had opened his eyes to the struggles parents face, and he felt grateful to be in a position to help another father find his way back. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the school grounds as Marcus arrived for his first day of work. His work boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way to the maintenance office, clutching the small paper with his schedule. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs and he took a deep breath, savoring this moment of new beginnings. The head custodian showed Marcus around, pointing out his responsibilities and the storage areas for supplies. Marcus listened attentively, nodding and asking questions when needed. His hands were eager to work, to prove himself worthy of this chance. Around 8 o'clock, the school grounds began filling with parents dropping off their children. Marcus was sweeping the front walkway when he heard a familiar voice. Officer Jake Martin stepped out of his truck, and Marcus watched as he carefully lifted a small black child from the back seat. The toddler's bright eyes scanned the schoolyard, landing on Marcus. Without hesitation, the little boy broke into a wide smile and waved enthusiastically. Marcus found himself waving back before he could think about it, surprised by the child's immediate warmth. "Good morning, Marcus," Jake called out, adjusting the toddler on his hip. "Glad to see you're getting started." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his eyes drawn to the child who was still beaming at him. "Thank you again for the opportunity." Jake smiled and bounced the toddler gently. "Say hi to Mr. Marcus," he encouraged. The child waved again, more vigorously this time. "Hi," he chirped, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Marcus couldn't help but notice how natural Jake seemed with the child, despite their obvious physical differences. Questions formed in his mind about their story, but he kept them to himself, focusing instead on returning the toddler's greeting with a gentle wave. "Well, we better get inside," Jake said, checking his watch. "Have a good first day, Marcus. You're going to do great here." As Jake carried the toddler toward the school entrance, Marcus leaned on his broom, watching them go. The boy peered over Jake's shoulder, offering one final wave before they disappeared inside. Marcus stood in the courtyard, his thoughts drifting to the unexpected sight of the white police officer and his black child. Their obvious bond stirred something in him, and he found himself wondering about their connection. With these thoughts occupying his mind, Marcus returned to his sweeping, the morning sun warming his back as he worked. The image of the smiling toddler stayed with him, an unexpected bright spot in his first day of legitimate work. Marcus found himself looking forward to recess time. Each day, among the crowd of playing children, Jake's little boy would spot him and light up with recognition. The little boy would waddle across the playground, arms outstretched, making Marcus's heart skip a beat. Sometimes he'd bring a colorful ball or a toy truck, offering them to Marcus with complete trust in his eyes. "Want to play?" the boy would ask, his small voice full of hope. Marcus would kneel down, careful to stay where the teachers could see him, and roll the ball back and forth. The simple game brought unexpected joy to his days. The child's laughter reminded him of another time, another place where he'd played similar games with his own son. During quiet moments, Marcus would watch the toddler play with other children, noting how his dark curls bounced when he ran, how his smile seemed to light up the whole playground. He couldn't help but wonder if his own son would have had the same infectious laugh, the same boundless energy. One particularly sunny afternoon, the toddler brought Marcus a picture book. Marcus sat on a nearby bench, the child climbing up next to him without hesitation. As he pointed to the colorful animals on the pages, Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest. His own son would be about this age now, maybe even enjoying the same stories. The sound of approaching footsteps made Marcus look up. Jake had arrived earlier than usual, and his expression was curious as he watched his son nestled comfortably beside Marcus. "He really seems to like you," Jake said, his voice friendly but carrying a hint of something else. Marcus carefully closed the book, helping the toddler slide off the bench. "He's a special kid," he replied, then took a deep breath. "I had a baby about his age before everything happened." Jake's eyebrows lifted slightly and he sat down on the bench. "You did?" "Yeah," Marcus nodded, watching the toddler play with the book's pages. "Being around your boy, it brings back memories. Good ones." He paused, his voice growing softer. "I lost him when I went away." Jake listened quietly, his eyes moving between Marcus and his son. Marcus could see the slight tension in Jake's shoulders, the careful way he was processing this information. But instead of pulling away, Jake leaned forward, ready to hear more. "Would you tell me about him?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. Marcus settled more comfortably on the bench, his eyes following the toddler as he played with his toy truck in the sand nearby. "As I told you earlier, I was working construction back then," he began, his voice soft with memory. "Just trying to make ends meet, you know. My boy was only a few months old when everything fell apart." Jake nodded encouragingly, though something in his expression had shifted. "Where was this?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Right here in the city, actually. Over on the east side," Marcus replied, running his hand over the weathered wood of the bench. "It was about 10 years ago now. December, the night they arrested me." He paused, swallowing hard. "I never got to say goodbye to him properly." Jake's hands tightened imperceptibly on his knees. The timeline matched perfectly. The same month he'd found the baby in the park. His heart began to race as Marcus continued. "I left him with a neighbor while I went to look for work," Marcus said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "But when everything went wrong, I couldn't get back to him. By the time I was cleared and released, nobody knew where he'd ended up." Jake's mouth felt dry. He watched his son playing in the sand, those familiar dark curls catching the sunlight. The same curls he'd first seen in that basket at the park 3 years ago. "Did you?" Jake's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Did you ever find out what happened to him?" Marcus shook his head slowly, noticing the strange tension in Jake's posture. "No. The neighbor said she couldn't keep him, and with no family around." He trailed off, studying Jake's face more intently now. "Is everything okay?" Jake stood up abruptly, his movement stiff. "Yeah, just remembered I have an early shift tomorrow." He called out to his son, perhaps a bit too loudly. "Time to go, buddy." The toddler looked up, pouting slightly at having his play interrupted. Jake quickly scooped him up, avoiding Marcus's questioning gaze. "Thanks for sharing your story," Jake said, the words coming out rushed and formal. "I'll see you tomorrow." Marcus watched them leave, noting how quickly Jake walked to his truck. Something about the officer's reaction felt off, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Jake knew more than he was letting on. As the truck pulled away, Marcus sat alone on the bench, his mind turning over every detail of their conversation, wondering what had caused such a sudden change in Jake's behavior. Later that day, Marcus sat in his dimly lit apartment. His mind kept circling back to Jake's strange reaction earlier that day, the way the officer had tensed up when Marcus mentioned December 2020, how quickly he'd gathered the child and left. Running his hands over his face, Marcus reached for an old photo he kept in his wallet, the only picture he had of his baby boy. Though faded and creased, it showed a tiny infant with distinctive dark curls, the same curls he'd been noticing on Jake's son. Across town, Jake paced in his living room, occasionally glancing at his sleeping toddler through the open bedroom door. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out the adoption paperwork from a drawer. The date jumped out at him immediately, December 15th, the night he'd found the baby in the park. Jake spread the documents across his coffee table, his police training kicking in as he analyzed the timeline. Marcus's story aligned perfectly, too perfectly. The location, the timing, even the description of his son matched. His stomach churned as he remembered Marcus's gentle interactions with the toddler at school. Marcus grabbed his keys, determination setting his jaw. He couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The way Jake had practically fled today, the matching timeline, the physical resemblance. It all pointed to one possibility. He had to know the truth. Jake was still reviewing the papers when he heard the knock. His heart seemed to stop for a moment. Through the window, he could see Marcus's familiar silhouette on his front porch. The streetlight cast long shadows across his visitor's face, but Jake could see the resolve in his stance. "Officer Martin," Marcus called softly through the door. "I need to talk to you, please." Jake's hand hovered over the doorknob, his breath catching in his throat. After what felt like an eternity, he turned the handle, revealing Marcus standing there with a mix of determination and uncertainty in his eyes. "May I come in?" Marcus asked quietly. "I think we both know what we need to discuss." Jake stood frozen for a moment, his protective instincts warring with his sense of right and wrong. Finally, he stepped aside, allowing Marcus to enter, knowing this conversation could change everything. Jake's living room felt smaller than usual as Marcus settled onto the edge of the couch. The coffee table between them was scattered with adoption papers, their corners yellowed with age. Through the half-open bedroom door, the soft sound of the toddler's steady breathing provided a gentle backdrop to the heavy silence. Marcus cleared his throat. "I think we both know why I'm here, Officer Martin." His voice was quiet but steady. The timing, the location, it all fits. That child. He paused, his eyes moving toward the bedroom door. "I believe he might be my son." Jake's hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I found him in Jefferson Park," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a cold December night. Some kids spotted a basket near the swings. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "December, right before I was wrongfully convicted." He pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet. "This is the only picture I have of him." And Jake's heart seemed to skip a beat as he looked at the image, the same dark curls, the same shaped eyes. The resemblance was undeniable. "I followed every procedure," Jake explained, gesturing to the papers on the table. "Contacted CPS, filed reports, waited for anyone to claim him. Nobody ever came forward." "Because I couldn't," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. "I was already behind bars for something I didn't do." He took a deep breath. "I'd like to get a DNA test if you're willing." Jake felt his protective instincts surge. "What would you do?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "If he is your son, what then?" Marcus looked down at his hands. "I won't lie to you. I don't know exactly. But I know I won't abandon him again. I can't." He met Jake's eyes. "I just need to know." After a moment of tense silence, Jake nodded. "There's a clinic on Mason Street. We can meet there tomorrow while he's at school." "Thank you," Marcus said softly, standing up. "I know this isn't easy for you." Jake walked him to the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. As Marcus stepped onto the porch, both men exchanged a look of understanding. They were bound together now by their love for the same child, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. Next day, Jake's alarm buzzed at 5 in the morning, but he was already awake. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the DNA test ahead. The soft patter of rain against his bedroom window matched his somber mood as he lay there, gathering courage for the day ahead. Down the hall, he heard the toddlers stirring. Usually, Jake would hurry to get them both ready for their morning routine, but today felt different. He moved slowly, deliberately, taking in every precious moment. "Good morning, buddy," Jake said softly, lifting the sleepy child from his bed. The boy's warm weight in his arms felt more significant than ever. Jake held him a little longer than usual, breathing in the sweet baby shampoo smell of his hair. They shared breakfast together, Jake making funny faces as he helped the toddler eat his cereal. Each giggle, each messy spoonful, each da-da felt like memories he needed to store away carefully. At the clinic, Marcus was already waiting outside, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets against the morning chill. The two men nodded to each other, their greeting carrying the weight of what was to come. Inside, a nurse with kind eyes led them to a small examination room. "The process is simple," she explained, pulling out 2 sealed collection kits. "We'll take a cheek swab from you, Marcus, and match it with the DNA sample of Jake's child. The lab will process it right away." As they waited, Marcus broke the silence. "You know, in prison," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I used to imagine him learning to walk, saying his first words. I'd picture teaching him to ride a bike, watching him grow up." He paused, swallowing hard. "Even when everything else felt hopeless, those dreams kept me going." Jake listened, his heart aching with understanding. He recognized the same love he felt for the boy reflected in Marcus's words. "I know it might not mean much," Marcus continued, "but I can see how much you care for him, how good you are with him." Jake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence between them. "The results will be ready in about an hour," the nurse announced, returning briefly. "You're welcome to wait here or—" "There's a coffee shop around the corner," Marcus suggested, looking at Jake. "Maybe we could—" "Yeah," Jake agreed, standing up. "That would be good." They walked toward the door together, 2 fathers united by love for the same child, both dreading and hoping for what the next hour would bring. Jake and Marcus found a quiet corner in the small cafe, settling into worn leather chairs with their steaming cups. The morning crowd had thinned, leaving only the gentle hum of coffee machines and soft music in the background. They sat in companionable silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. Marcus wrapped his hands around his cup, drawing warmth from it before speaking. "What was it like?" he asked softly. "Raising him on your own?" Jake stirred his coffee slowly, gathering his thoughts. "Honestly, I was terrified at first," he admitted. "I didn't know the first thing about babies. I remember standing in the store staring at different types of formula, completely lost." A small smile crossed Marcus's face, encouraging Jake to continue. "Those first few weeks were rough," Jake said, shaking his head. "I'd never been so tired in my life. Mrs. Harper, my neighbor, she helped a lot, but nights were the hardest. Sometimes he'd cry for hours, and I wouldn't know why." "But you figured it out," Marcus observed quietly. "Yeah, slowly. Trial and error, mostly." Jake's expression softened as he remembered. "The first time he smiled at me, really smiled, not just gas. It made everything worth it. Even the judgmental looks from people who couldn't understand why a single white cop was raising a black baby." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't. Still isn't sometimes," Jake acknowledged. "But we've built a good life together. He's got this way of lighting up a room just by being in it, you know?" "I've noticed that about him," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "At the school, the way he makes everyone smile." Jake set his coffee down, leaning forward. "The hardest part wasn't the sleepless nights or the dirty diapers. It was wondering if I was doing right by him, if I was enough." "From what I've seen," Marcus said earnestly, You've been more than enough. The way you are with him, the love there, it's real. I want you to know I'm grateful for that. For everything you've done for him." Jake felt his eyes burn with unexpected tears. Before he could respond, both their phones buzzed simultaneously. The clinic's message was clear. The results were ready. They exchanged glances, the warmth of their conversation giving way to nervous anticipation. Without a word, they stood up, leaving their half-finished coffees behind as they headed back to face whatever truth awaited them. At the clinic, the nurse handed Jake and Marcus the sealed envelope containing the DNA test results. The small examination room felt even smaller as they stood side by side, the white paper trembling slightly in Jake's grip. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across their tense faces. "Would you like me to stay?" the nurse asked gently. Jake shook his head. "No, thank you, we'll be fine." After she left, Jake stared at the envelope, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. With unsteady fingers, he broke the seal and pulled out the paper inside. His eyes scanned the medical terminology until they landed on the conclusion at the bottom. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. "It's positive," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You're his father." Marcus let out a shaky breath, tears immediately streaming down his face. He leaned against the wall for support, overwhelmed by the confirmation of what he'd suspected. "My boy," he breathed. "I finally found him." Jake's composure crumbled. The paper slipped from his fingers as he pressed his hands to his face, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I can't lose him," he choked out. "He's my whole world. I know you're his father, but please, I can't." Marcus stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Jake's shoulder. "Hey, listen to me," he said softly, his own voice thick with emotion. "I'm not here to take him away from you." Jake looked up, his face streaked with tears. "You've given him everything I couldn't," Marcus continued. "A loving home, stability, safety. I won't destroy that. I want to be part of his life if you'll let me." "You mean, we can figure this out together," Marcus assured him. "He needs both of us. I don't want to disrupt his life or confuse him. We can take it slow, find a way to make this work." Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "You'd do that? Share custody?" "He's clearly loved and well cared for. That's all I ever wanted for him," Marcus said. "We can work out how to tell him when the time is right, how to move forward. But right now, knowing he's safe and happy with you, that means everything to me." The tension in Jake's shoulders began to ease. The fear that had been choking him started to loosen its grip. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for understanding." Marcus squeezed his shoulder. "We're both his fathers now. Different ways maybe, but both real. Let's focus on what's best for him." Jake's house felt unusually quiet that evening as he moved through the kitchen, mechanically preparing dinner for himself and his son. The toddler sat in his high chair, happily playing with his toy cars, completely unaware of the life-changing events that had unfolded that day. "Daddy, look," the little boy called out, making vrooming noises as he pushed a red car across the tray. Jake smiled, his heart aching with love and worry. "That's great, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. After dinner and getting the boys settled with his toys, Jake drove to Mrs. Harper's house. The familiar sight of her porch light glowing warmly in the dusk brought him a measure of comfort. She opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd sensed his need for guidance. "Come in, dear," she said, leading him to her cozy living room. "I'll put on some tea." Once they were settled with steaming mugs, Jake told her everything, about the DNA test, Marcus's reaction, and their agreement to share parenthood. Mrs. Harper listened intently, her kind eyes focused on Jake's face. When he finished, she set her mug down carefully. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "sometimes the best families aren't the ones we're born into, but the ones we build together." "I'm scared," Jake admitted. "What if it confuses him? What if he feels torn between us?" "Children can handle more than we think," Mrs. Harper replied. patting his hand. The key is to move slowly. Let him set the pace. Start with casual meetings, maybe at the park or during his playtime at school where he already knows Marcus. Jake nodded, drawing strength from her calm wisdom. Marcus has been so understanding. He doesn't want to disrupt our lives. Then you've already got the most important ingredient, 2 fathers who put the child's needs first. Next day, Jake called Marcus. His voice was steady, as he suggested they start with informal meetings at the school playground, where the toddler already felt comfortable with Marcus. That sounds perfect, Marcus agreed, relief evident in his voice. I just want to be part of his life, whatever way works best for him. We'll make this work, Jake assured him, feeling more confident. He deserves to know both his fathers. That night, as Jake tucked his son into bed, the boy reached up with sleepy arms for a hug. Jake held him close, breathing in the sweet scent of baby shampoo and feeling the small heart beating against his chest. In that moment, he knew with certainty that expanding their family to include Marcus wouldn't diminish the love between them. It would only make it grow stronger. If you enjoyed the story of Jake, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.